August 25, 1944, near Saint-Lô, Normandy. Before dawn, a rolling thunder of engines shakes the wet French earth as headlights cut thin tunnels through the fog. Thousands of olive-drab trucks, GMC, CCKWs, Studebakers, and Dodges, crawl forward like an iron river, stretching beyond the curve of the horizon. The drivers, many barely 20 years old and most of them African-American soldiers from segregated units, grip the wheels with raw hands as they advance into the night. Behind them, in scattered farmhouses and abandoned German positions, Wehrmacht prisoners mother in disbelief. A convoy this size, running continuously, was something their own officers insisted was physically impossible. Yet here it is, an endless supply artery roaring west to east, feeding General Patton's tanks as they tear through France faster than even U.S. planners predicted. And as the engines rise into a single unbroken growl, one thing becomes unmistakable. America is no longer just attacking by force. It is attacking with an entire industrial civilization. In the summer of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy transformed the Western Front from a dense, attritional battlefield into a high-speed pursuit. Operation Cobra shattered the German defensive line near Saint-Lô, and armored divisions under General George S. Patton surged through the breach with breathtaking momentum. But this sudden freedom of maneuver created a crippling problem. Patton's Third Army was outrunning its own fuel. The more ground U.S. forces liberated, the farther the supply depots fell behind. Tank engines, designed to drink hundreds of gallons per day, stood idle for lack of gasoline. Ammunition wagons lagged dozens of miles to the rear, and French ports capable of resupply were still either ruined, mined, or firmly in German hands. Victory, despite the speed of advance, was now strangling itself. Meanwhile, German commanders observing the Allied pursuit reached a comfortable conclusion. Drawing from their own logistical doctrine, rooted in rail transport, short supply lines, and carefully rationed mobility, they believed the American advance had to stall. The United States, in their view, lacked the discipline and organizational culture for sustained frontline logistics. The Wehrmacht had seen the Americans struggle during the winter of 1943-44 in Italy, where mountainous terrain slowed resupply to a crawl. They remembered North Africa, where Allied fuel shortages nearly sabotaged operations. And above all, they believed no army in history could maintain a mobile front consuming tens of thousands of gallons of fuel per day across hundreds of miles of wrecked European terrain. Their war games assumed the same conclusion: the Americans would run dry. But those assumptions ignored a crucial reality. Unlike Germany, starved by Allied bombing, collapsing railways, and dwindling oil, the United States possessed a level of industrial output unmatched in global history. Its factories built more trucks in a single month than Germany could build in half a year. Its oil fields delivered oceans of fuel. Its personnel system could mobilize drivers, mechanics, road engineers, dispatchers, and traffic controllers on a scale no European army could have imagined. And in the Transportation Corps sat thousands of African-American soldiers who had been trained, tested, and, despite segregation, proven indispensable in every theater of the war. These men were about to do something no modern logistics system had ever attempted: create a 24/7, 400-mile one-way highway dedicated solely to feeding a war machine on the move. The idea was radical in its simplicity. If the Allies lacked functional ports, functioning rails, and nearby depots, then they would build mobility itself into a weapon. Supplies unloaded in Normandy would not wait for depots to be relocated. Instead, they would be immediately placed onto trucks and driven directly to advancing frontline armies, without pause, without reloading, and without interruption. This rolling pipeline would be the Red Ball Express, an 82-day experiment in perpetual motion that would become the lifeline of the Allied advance from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany. Yet beneath its eventual success lay deeper stories: the racial dynamics of segregated troops who proved themselves indispensable, the staggering mechanical losses that forced crews to cannibalize vehicles at roadside, the fatigue-driven accidents that cost dozens of lives, and the psychological shock experienced by German commanders who watched this unstoppable torrent of American logistics materialize where their military doctrine insisted it could never exist. And as Patton's tanks pushed eastward at speeds no strategist had forecast, the German high command confronted a sobering truth. America was not merely fielding divisions, it was unleashing an entire industrial nation, mobile, adaptive, and fueled by men who were determined to prove their worth in a world that still doubted them. By late August 1944, supply officers faced a race they were losing. Third Army tank columns could advance 50 to 70 miles in a single day, but their fuel convoys, snaking along cratered roads, dodging refugee traffic, and negotiating blown bridges, could only crawl. Patton himself issued ever more urgent requests for gasoline, famously remarking that his men could eat their belts if they had to, but they could not move an inch without fuel. An armored division consumed roughly 350,000 gallons per day, and Third Army had multiple armored divisions simultaneously in motion. At the worst point, the entire front risked halting within 72 hours. Something had to break the deadlock, and it would not be another airborne drop, naval bombardment, or tank breakthrough. It would be trucks, thousands of them. The Transportation Corps, operating out of Normandy, proposed a radical solution: convert an entire network of French roads into a dedicated, one-directional supply superhighway. No civilians, no returning traffic, no wandering units, just non-stop forward motion, an artery pumping fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts directly to Patton's spearheads. Commanders named it after the railroad term for expedited freight, the Red Ball, a symbol for priority cargo that must never be delayed. But naming the system was the easy part. Building it required two things Germany no longer possessed: industrial capacity and manpower. Here, the backbone of the operation formed quickly and quietly from the ranks of segregated African-American truck companies. More than 70% of the drivers assigned to the Red Ball Express were black soldiers, many of whom had been relegated to service roles despite repeatedly requesting combat duty. They were organized into quartermaster truck companies, each with dozens of vehicles, mechanics, and dispatchers, and were now being asked to execute the most dangerous and demanding driving operation of the European War. These men would steer 6x6 GMC CCKW trucks through blackout conditions under threat of Luftwaffe strafing, while navigating roads narrowed by wreckage and rubble. Many lacked sleep, many lacked recognition, but none lacked resolve. For the Red Ball to function, engineers had to designate two primary routes, one northbound, one southbound. The northbound route carried supplies from Normandy toward the advancing armies. The southbound route returned empty trucks for reloading. Military police enforced strict discipline. Only Red Ball vehicles could use these roads, and any unauthorized vehicle could be detained on the spot. Speed limits were enforced not to slow drivers, but to prevent collisions on tight rural roads with limited visibility. Yet even with control measures, accidents were inevitable. Truck convoys would often lose 10 to 20 vehicles per day to crashes, mechanical failure, or road collapse. Meanwhile, Patton's advance created a psychological situation no manual had prepared for. The faster his tanks moved, the further the supply lines stretched, transforming every additional mile of French countryside into a logistical liability. German commanders monitoring this rapid expansion predicted collapse. They believed the Americans would choke on their own success, just as German forces had during the 1941 advance towards Moscow when logistics buckled under winter conditions. But the Germans underestimated the American response. Instead of slowing down to consolidate, U.S. planners doubled down on mobility. The new motto was simple: keep the trucks rolling. Human moments emerged within this logistical storm. Drivers developed rituals to stay awake, chewing coffee grounds, singing together, and slapping their own helmets to stave off fatigue. Some tied string from their wrists to the steering wheel, so that a drooping arm would jerk them awake before drifting into a ditch. Many taped photographs of family to the dashboard. Others scribbled small notes to themselves, reminding them how many miles until the next checkpoint. And every few miles, at way stations lit only by hooded lamps, military police handed out directions on index cards because maps were useless in the fog and darkness. With convoys required to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the night became as dangerous as combat. Meanwhile, the German High Command watched with widening disbelief. Reconnaissance units reported seeing endless headlights along French roads, lines so long they could not discern where they began or ended. Prisoners of war later recalled hearing convoys rumbling for hours during the night, creating an unnerving impression
of limitless American resources. Some German officers joked bitterly that America was fighting the war with rubber, believing the United States had simply decided to pave over France with tires and gasoline. Others were less amused. They recognized, with a mixture of admiration and resignation, that this display of motorized logistics was something the German state could no longer match. But the Red Ball Express was no miracle. It was a grinding contest of endurance. The trucks themselves struggled under the strain. Designed to last a few years under normal conditions, they were now running hundreds of miles per day, overloaded with fuel drums or ammunition crates that exceeded recommended tonnage. Mechanics faced catastrophic failure rates. Some companies reported that 30% of vehicles were out of action each day, forcing crews to scavenge parts from wrecked or abandoned trucks along the roadside. Axles cracked, transmissions overheated, tires shredded, engines seized. Yet the mechanics, working in fields, barns, or roadside clearings, repaired vehicles with astonishing speed, often cannibalizing 3 ruined trucks to make one functional one. Their improvisation became the hidden engine of the Red Ball.
Every few paragraphs of the operation, danger reasserted itself. Fuel trucks made tempting targets for German air attacks. Even during the declining months of the Luftwaffe, small fighter bomber raids harassed the convoys. Drivers learned to listen for the shriek of diving engines, often swerving off the road moments before cannon fire ripped through the tops of their trucks. Some soldiers carried rifles, but against aircraft, they were nearly useless. Their defense was momentum, never become a stationary target. Keep rolling, drivers reminded each other, even when wounded. Meanwhile, the road networks, already battered by pre-invasion bombing, were deteriorating under the weight of heavy traffic. Engineers raced to shore up collapsing bridges, fill bomb craters, and widen pinch points along the route. Entire villages had to be rerouted around because their narrow medieval streets could not accommodate convoys of hundreds of vehicles. In a single night, engineers laid down more than a mile of temporary roadway using pierced steel planking to allow the trucks to pass through a particularly boggy valley. There was no end to the improvisation. Still, the operation escalated beyond what any planner had expected. Within days of its launch, the Red Ball Express had 5,958 trucks running along its routes. Within weeks, it delivered 12,500 tons of supplies per day, a logistical output previously thought impossible outside a major rail network. All of this occurred while frontline armies advanced across a rapidly changing terrain, forcing drivers to update their destinations almost daily. What had begun as an emergency measure was turning into a logistical juggernaut. Amid this crush of steel and gasoline, racism remained an ever-present reality. The African-American drivers who formed the backbone of the operation served in segregated units, ate in separate mess halls, and often lacked the formal praise given to white troops performing similar duties. Yet commanders on the ground quickly recognized their indispensable role. Many officers privately admitted that without these drivers, the Allied advance would have stalled within the first week. Some white officers rewrote earlier assumptions about black soldiers' capabilities as they witnessed the discipline, endurance, and skill required to keep the convoys moving under life-threatening conditions. Recognition would come slowly and unevenly, but the evidence was undeniable. These men were sustaining the liberation of a continent. Many cliffhangers surged across the front line. In early September, Patton's columns captured key river crossings, pushing eastward at a pace that stunned both Allies and Germans alike. But every mile gained increased the pressure on the Red Ball. Supplies now had to travel not 100 miles, but 200, then 300, then over 400. Fuel arrived warm from the sloshing motion of the trip, often smelling of exhaust and dust. Ammunition trucks became rolling hazards. A single spark could ignite a catastrophe. Yet onward they went. The Germans, desperate to slow the American juggernaut, began planting more mines and increasing ambushes along the supply routes. Small patrols of German infantry, left behind during the retreat or operating as stay-behind elements, occasionally fired on convoys. Drivers learned to accelerate through gunfire, duck low, and maintain formation. The risk of hitting roadside obstacles or other trucks increased, but stopping meant death. Military police units sometimes arrived hours later to clear the fuel spills, shattered crates, and mangled metal of trucks that never reached their destination. Yet for every truck destroyed, another took its place. The numbers spoke louder than gunfire. As long as the red ball kept moving, the Third Army would not stop. And that reality soon confronted German strategists with a horrifying realization. If American logistics remained this strong, the Wehrmacht's defensive plans for autumn 1944 would collapse before they even began. Still, the strain on the drivers deepened. Some soldiers went weeks without more than 2 or 3 hours of sleep at a time. Their eyes burned from prolonged exposure to dust exhaust and the strain of driving under blackout conditions. Tragedies accumulated. Trucks overturning in ditches, collisions in fog, drivers crushed beneath their own vehicles during emergency repairs. The Red Ball Express was as dangerous as many combat zones, but its casualties were quieter, unheralded by medals, rarely mentioned in newspapers. And yet, in this bleak environment, camaraderie thrived. Drivers marked milestones with small celebrations shared at remote supply points. Mechanics took pride in resurrecting trucks thought beyond salvaging. Dispatchers memorized every bend, incline, and landmark on their routes. And the African-American soldiers, denied so many forms of recognition, took immense pride in knowing their work was accelerating the liberation of Europe. They understood what many historians would later confirm. Logistics, more than any other factor, determined the tempo of modern war. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express was delivering such staggering quantities of supplies that German officers began openly discussing its strategic impact. Captured diaries mention convoys, stretching farther than the eye could see. One German colonel remarked that the Allies rolled over France on wheels, referring not just to tanks, but to the thousands of trucks enabling their advance. German intelligence analysts reviewing aerial photos of the highways calculated that no European army, German, Soviet, or British, had ever achieved sustained supply throughput on this scale. What they saw was not a military innovation, but a civilizational one. Unaware of these analyses, the drivers continued their relentless push. Rainstorms turned roads to mud, threatening to swallow trucks whole. Fog blanketed routes so thickly that drivers could only follow the faint outline of the truck ahead. Winter loomed, promising ice, snow, and mechanical nightmares. Yet the need for fuel and ammunition was unending. Every day, depots near Normandy filled with new cargo from the United States, mountains of crates, shells, rations, and fuel drums that needed to reach the front immediately. The Red Ball Express became the artery of an army that could not, must not pause. By October, the system was reaching its physical limit. Trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Drivers collapsed from exhaustion. Engineers struggled to maintain road quality in worsening weather. Yet even then, the operation refused to slow. The Transportation Corps launched auxiliary routes, the Green Diamond and others, to help ease the burden. Still, the Red Ball remained the backbone, the one system commanders relied on to prevent paralysis. Then came one of the greatest operational pressures of the entire war. The Allied advance reached the German border. It was here, near the Siegfried Line, that the supply crisis peaked. Every additional gallon of fuel had to leapfrog past the previous day's destination. Every mile now mattered. German defenses were stiffening. Autumn rains were turning roads into rivers. The next phase of the war would be impossible without overwhelming logistical support. And the trucks kept rolling. As the Red Ball Express surged into its second month, the pressure on every component, men, machines, and roads, neared a breaking point. The ambitions of the Allied High Command grew with the speed of the advance. Patton argued for a rapid thrust toward the Saar. Montgomery pressed for supplies to support Operation Market Garden, and Bradley sought to consolidate gains along a broad front. But the logistical reality was stark. The trucks could not be everywhere at once. Every gallon delivered to one army was a gallon denied to another. Fuel became a strategic weapon, more decisive than armor or infantry. And the Red Ball Express, though capable of miracles, remained bound by physics. Trucks could only drive so fast, mechanics could only repair so many engines, and drivers could only stay awake for so long. Meanwhile, trucks were operating in conditions no manual anticipated. Roads churned into sludge beneath relentless traffic. Convoys swerved around ruined German vehicles, smashed wagons, and abandoned artillery. Horses, killed during retreat, still lay along the shoulders of highways, stiffening in the morning cold. The smell of fuel, raw, bitter, clinging to the air, mixed with wet soil and engine exhaust. Soldiers joked grimly that you could walk the supply route blindfolded, guided only by the scent of gasoline. The human pulse of the Red Ball beat strongest in moments of peril. In early October, a truck from the 39 18th Quartermaster Truck Company suffered an engine fire while descending a hill slick with rain. The cab filled with choking smoke, visibility vanished, and the truck veered dangerously toward the edge of the road where a 30-foot drop waited. The driver, Private William Grayson, kicked open the door, leapt onto the wet pavement, and sprinted alongside the burning vehicle while trying to steer it away from the cliff. He succeeded with seconds to spare before collapsing in the mud as the engine exploded. He would suffer burns on his arms and face, and his truck was destroyed, but the convoy behind him avoided a pileup that could have claimed dozens of lives. Moments like this, seldom recorded in official histories, defined the Red Ball Express. Meanwhile, mechanics lived on adrenaline and improvisation. In makeshift repair yards lit with lanterns and headlights, they worked knee-deep in mud. They replaced transmissions in the dark. They patched holes in radiators with scrap metal. They spliced electrical lines using knife blades, tape, and wires stripped from wrecks. Some companies began carrying organ trucks, vehicles filled with salvaged parts harvested from destroyed CCKWs. These rolling graveyards of machine organs enabled broken trucks to be resurrected within hours. Without this grim ingenuity, the Red Ball would have collapsed under its own weight. German military observers watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and despair. Reports reaching the German High Command painted a picture of Americans driving convoys of hundreds of trucks in blackout conditions, moving traffic at a pace the Wehrmacht had never achieved. German generals, long accustomed to viewing mobility as their comparative strength, were forced to confront the reversal of their doctrine. The Americans were no longer tethered to railways or depots. They could project power with astonishing elasticity. What the Wehrmacht once considered its strategic advantage had now become a liability, and the German officer corps confronted a chilling realization. The United States had devised a logistical weapon unlike anything fielded in modern warfare. Yet inside the Red Ball system, tension simmered. The most painful debates centered on who would receive priority supply. Patton argued relentlessly for fuel, insisting that a concentrated American thrust into Germany could end the war by Christmas. Montgomery demanded support for his ambitious airborne and ground offensive in the Netherlands, and Bradley attempted a compromise that served neither plan effectively. The result was predictable. The Red Ball Express was pulled in multiple directions at once, forced to support a broad front instead of enabling a decisive breakthrough. The drivers felt this strain. Their route assignments changed daily. Their destinations were sometimes hundreds of miles apart from one day to the next. Confusion became routine. Yet orders were orders, and they kept moving. Many cliffhangers multiplied in the field. Convoy commanders received reports of German paratroopers spotted near supply routes, stragglers from the retreat, or small sabotage teams sent to disrupt logistics. Drivers, armed primarily with carbines and pistols, were ill-prepared for ambushes. In isolated cases, German soldiers fired from tree lines, attempting to hit fuel trucks and ignite infernos that would block the road. But such actions, while frightening, achieved little. The sheer volume of American traffic overwhelmed any attempt at disruption. For every truck damaged, 50 more surged past before the smoke even cleared. Behind the steel and gasoline, racial dynamics played out in complex ways. African American drivers bore the brunt of the operation's physical dangers and received little of its political praise. Segregation still defined their daily life. Separate units, separate barracks, separate mess lines. Some officers doubted their discipline or skill, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Yet commanders depended deeply on these men. They entrusted them with fuel loads that could alter the course of campaigns. They relied on them during night runs when disorientation was lethal. And as the operation escalated, their respect, quiet, reluctant, but real, grew.
Many officers later admitted that the Red Ball Express could not have existed without African American troops.
That reality emerged starkly one night in early November. A convoy was crossing through a forested sector where German stragglers had been reported. Rain hammered the canvas tarps, mud splashed up onto windshields. The lead truck swerved suddenly, shot at by unseen rifles, and skidded sideways into a ditch. The following driver slammed his brakes, causing the entire convoy to accordion into chaos. But the soldiers reacted with practiced discipline. Drivers leapt from their cabs, took cover behind wheels and axles, and returned fire. Their engines idled in the darkness, headlights off, rain masking the sound of movement. When the firing stopped, the Germans had vanished into the trees. The convoy suffered several damaged trucks, but no casualties. The drivers pushed the vehicles back into line and continued on schedule. It was not a highlight of a campaign or a famous battle. It was a moment that happened hundreds of times. Small, dangerous, unrecognized. Yet it was in these moments that the Red Ball Express proved not only its logistical strength, but also its fighting resilience. Meanwhile, depots in Normandy overflowed with supplies. Liberty ships arrived daily from the United States, carrying mountains of material. The bottleneck was not production, but movement. The front demanded more than the Red Ball could deliver. Generators, radios, tank parts, artillery shells, blankets, and food all screened for space on the trucks. Quartermaster officers performed triage, prioritizing fuel above all else. Soldiers joked that if ammunition ran short, they could throw fuel cans at the enemy. There was plenty of that. But behind the humor lay urgency. Without gasoline, the tanks would stop. If the tanks stopped, the opportunity to enter Germany before winter would evaporate. As the front drew closer to the German border, the weather worsened. Roads turned treacherous. Ice formed at dawn and dusk. Fog swallowed entire convoys, leaving drivers unable to see more than a few feet ahead. Trucks slid off embankments, rolled into ditches, or collided in chain reactions. Military police worked frantically to reroute traffic around accident sites. Drivers cursed the weather, but they pressed on. They had internalized the prime directive: keep the trucks rolling. Stopping meant chaos, and chaos threatened the lifeline. These relentless operations built psychological shock within the German ranks. Wehrmacht soldiers, retreating eastward, frequently reported convoys that never end, a phrase repeated in numerous intelligence summaries. Some compared the sound of American logistics to the distant rumble of approaching storms, constant, unstoppable. German fuel depots were either empty or destroyed. Their armored units rationed every gallon. In stark contrast, American trucks carried such abundance that fuel cans spilled from their cargo beds. The disparity was so vast that German officers began describing U.S. logistics as industrial warfare, not merely military procedure. Back in French villages, civilians witnessed the spectacle with awe. After years under occupation, the sight of thousands of trucks roaring through narrow streets offered a glimpse of overwhelming Allied power. Children waved at the drivers. Farmers stepped aside as convoys turned mud across their fields. At night, the glow of concealed headlights resembled ghostly fireflies drifting through the countryside. For many French citizens, the Red Ball Express was liberation in motion. Yet, even as the operation reached unprecedented scale, trouble loomed. The demand for fuel and ammunition surged beyond capacity. The race towards Germany slowed not because of German resistance, but because of the strain placed on logistics. Commanders faced a cruel arithmetic. The further they advanced, the less effective the Red Ball became. By mid-November, trucks were traveling over 450 miles daily just to deliver a single load. Fatigue and mechanical strain skyrocketed. Accidents increased. Trucks died on the roadside faster than mechanics could resurrect them. The crisis reached its peak in the second week of November. German counterattacks stiffened along the Siegfried Line. Allied momentum faltered. Tanks sat idle. Crews frustrated. Officers desperate. For the first time since August, the Red Ball Express was no longer masking the logistical gap. It was revealing it. The system had surpassed every expectation, but now approached the limits of endurance. Something had to give. And it did. On November 16, 1944, after 82 days of continuous operation, the Red Ball Express, having delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies
across 122 million ton-miles, was finally shut down. Not because it failed, but because it had achieved its purpose. The Allies had secured major ports like Antwerp and Cherbourg. Railways were being repaired, and supply lines could finally shorten. The trucks would still drive, the drivers still labor, but the era of the frantic, desperate convoys was over. And the German High Command, staring at the sheer magnitude of what these trucks had accomplished, realized that their assumptions about U.S. logistics had been disastrously wrong. The Red Ball Express had changed the war.
The rain had turned to sleet. The wind howled through shattered trees and the charred frames of village barns as American tanks crouched motionless on the ridgelines. Their crews waited for fuel that wasn't coming. Inside Patton's forward command post, maps were drenched with red annotations, arrows pushing east, arrows that could go no farther. He was convinced the war could still be broken open before winter, but all across the front, engines sat cold and silent. Then, through the mist, came the low rumble. At first, just a distant vibration, then a rhythmic growl, then unmistakable thunder, the final wave of the Red Ball Express. Convoy after convoy emerged from the fog, engines straining, trucks coated in mud and ice, headlights hooded to mere dim glows. The drivers were gaunt, many unshaven for weeks, eyes raw from sleepless nights and burning exhaust. Mechanics rode on fenders, listening for failing pistons. Tarps whipped violently in the winter wind. And still they came, hundreds of trucks, then thousands, rolling through the mud toward the front for one last push. This moment became the Red Ball Express's defining crescendo. For German observers positioned along the Siegfried Line, the sight was surreal. Their binoculars captured endless columns of American trucks snaking toward the battlefield, headlights forming a spectral chain against the gray sky. Radio intercepts recorded stunned conversations. They still have fuel? How? This is impossible. The roads are destroyed. They are bringing an entire nation with them. The power of this moment was not measured by explosions or tank charges, but by realization. On that frozen November day, German commanders understood the truth. No tactical brilliance, no defensive line, no counterattack could overcome an enemy able to deliver this scale of fuel and ammunition under such punishing conditions. Patton's tanks roared back to life, their exhaust clouds rising like hot breath from steel beasts awakened from hibernation. Guns loaded, engines warmed, tracks clanked forward. The offensive was not turning into a sudden breakthrough. November mud and German fortifications saw to that, but it was moving again. The Red Ball Express had kept the Third Army alive long enough to carry the fight into Germany itself. And as the last truck in the final convoy rumbled past the command post, its engine knocking loudly from overuse, an African-American driver saluted an officer standing roadside. The officer returned the gesture, but the driver didn't see it. He had already slumped over the wheel, asleep before the truck even coasted to a stop. The Red Ball Express had reached its limit, exactly at the moment history needed it most. Compromise that served neither plan effectively. The result was predictable. The Red Ball Express was pulled in multiple directions at once, forced to support a broad front instead of enabling a decisive breakthrough. The drivers felt this strain. Their route assignments changed daily. Their destinations were sometimes hundreds of miles apart from one day to the next. Confusion became routine, yet orders were orders, and they kept moving. Many cliffhangers multiplied in the field. Convoy commanders received reports of German paratroopers spotted near supply routes, stragglers from the retreat, or small sabotage teams sent to disrupt logistics. Drivers, armed primarily with carbines and pistols, were ill-prepared for ambushes. In isolated cases, German soldiers fired from tree lines, attempting to hit fuel trucks and ignite infernos that would block the road. But such actions, while frightening, achieved little. The sheer volume of American traffic overwhelmed any attempt to disruption. For every truck damaged, 50 more surged past before the smoke even cleared. Behind the steel and gasoline, racial dynamics played out in complex ways. African-American drivers bore the brunt of the operation's physical dangers and received little of its political praise. Segregation still defined their daily life. Separate units, separate barracks, separate mess lines. Some officers doubted their discipline or skill, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Yet commanders depended deeply on these men. They entrusted them with fuel loads that could alter the course of campaigns. They relied on them during night runs when disorientation was lethal. And as the operation escalated, their respect, quiet, reluctant but real, grew. Many officers later admitted that the Red Ball Express could not have existed without African American troops. In the days after its shutdown on November 16, 1944, commanders conducted the first full analyses of what the Red Ball Express had accomplished. The numbers were staggering. 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 122 million ton-miles covered, 5,958 trucks in continual circulation, 23,000 drivers, most of them African American, carrying the burden of a continent's liberation on their shoulders. Historians would later calculate that the Red Ball Express shortened the war in Europe by at least 6 months. Without it, Patton's Third Army would have stalled in the fields of France. Market Garden would have been impossible. The Allied front would have ossified far short of Germany. Every major offensive from late August to early November depended on its logistical artery. Yet the men who made it possible received a fraction of the recognition they deserved. African American troops faced the bitter irony of having performed one of the most physically grueling and strategically decisive operations of the war while still living under segregation. Many returned home to a country that thanked them with parades, but not with equality. Even so, their achievements became part of the U.S. Army's internal reckoning. Officers who had once doubted their ability now cited their discipline, skill, and courage in official evaluations. After the war, these experiences helped accelerate the Army's shift toward desegregation, culminating in President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. On the German side, the Red Ball Express shattered long-held assumptions. Post-war interrogations with captured German generals revealed a consistent theme. They believed American logistics to be clumsy, inexperienced, overly mechanized, and incapable of supporting rapid advances. Many imagined U.S. armor as easy prey once fuel lines stretched too thin. The Red Ball Express proved those assumptions catastrophically wrong. American logistics had outpaced German doctrine in every dimension: speed, volume, flexibility, personnel, industrial support. The Wehrmacht, once a pioneer of mobile warfare, had been overtaken by an opponent whose industrial depth dwarfed every calculation. The psychological impact lingered. German officers described the supply convoys as endless, unstoppable, and inhumanly fast. Some spoke of hearing trucks rumble through the night for hours, an auditory reminder that the Americans possessed resources Germany could not dream of matching. In diaries, several officers called the logistics system the real Allied secret weapon, a more decisive force than tanks, aircraft, or artillery. For the Americans, the Red Ball Express became a blueprint for future operations. It introduced traffic control systems, dispatching methods, maintenance innovations, and personnel logistics that shaped the U.S. Army's modern supply doctrine. It demonstrated how flexibility, improvisation, and raw manpower could compensate for destroyed infrastructure. Most importantly, it proved that mobility, not static strength, wins modern wars. Yet for the drivers, the aftermath was quieter. Many suffered long-term effects: back injuries from rough roads, chronic fatigue from months of sleeplessness, hearing loss from engine noise, and emotional trauma from crashes and ambushes. They returned to families who had no idea that their sons, brothers, and husbands had helped carry the Allied armies across France and into Germany. The Red Ball Express had no campaign ribbon, no battle streamers, no special unit citation. It had only its legacy and the men who made it real. The crisis reached its peak in the second week of November. German counterattacks stiffened along the Siegfried Line. Allied momentum faltered. Tanks sat idle, crews frustrated, officers desperate. For the first time since August, the Red Ball Express was no longer masking the logistical gap. It was revealing it. The system had surpassed every expectation, but now approached the limits of endurance. Something had to give. And it did. On November 16, 1944, after 82 days of continuous operation, the Red Ball Express, having delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies across 122 million ton-miles, was finally shut down. Not because it failed, but because it had achieved its purpose. The Allies had secured major ports like Antwerp and Cherbourg, railways were being repaired, and supply lines could finally shorten. The trucks would still drive, the drivers still labor, but the era of the frantic, desperate, and ceaseless convoys was over. And the German High Command, staring at the sheer magnitude of what these trucks had accomplished,
realized that their assumptions about American logistics had been disastrously wrong. The Red Ball Express had changed the war.
In the end, the Red Ball Express was not just a supply operation, it was a revelation. It proved that wars are won not only by the men who fire the guns, but by those who deliver the fuel, the food, the ammunition, and the parts that keep the guns firing. It exposed the fatal flaw in German strategy, underestimating a nation capable of mobilizing its entire industrial, racial, and social structure to power a single offensive arm. And it illuminated the quiet heroism of thousands of African-American drivers who, despite segregation and silence, kept the American war machine alive when it mattered most. Back in the fields of Normandy, the ruts carved by their convoys still mark the earth, silent echoes of the roaring steel river that once poured eastward night and day. And as historians trace the final path to Allied victory, they return again and again to that thunder in the distance, rising before dawn on August 25, 1944, the moment when German generals laughed at American logistics until the Red Ball Express proved them wrong, mile by relentless mile.